There was a time when the American dream seemed like it was within anybody's reach. At least, that's what the old commercials would have you believe. There was a paper envelope, folded so many times it was almost falling apart, tucked away in the drawer of some ordinary kitchen. Inside, there was no fortune. There was a promise, and that promise, kept week after week by thousands of black families between 1950 and 1970, ended up building something no bank was ever willing to build for them. If you want to know how they pulled it off, subscribe right now, because on this channel we dig up, story after story, the wealth the black community built against every single odd. Back then, people had houses with perfect little lawns, brand new cars parked in the driveway, families smiling around the dinner table, and a promise that kept repeating itself over and over. If you worked hard, the future would be better. But that picture never told the whole story. While millions of people were chasing that ideal, millions of others were finding out that hard work alone wasn't always enough. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, thousands of black families had to face obstacles that went way beyond just earning a good paycheck. In a lot of places across the United States, the problem wasn't how much money you had in your pocket, it was where you were allowed to live, which bank was willing to even listen to you, or what doors got shut in your face before you'd even crossed the threshold. And still, so many of those families managed to do something that seems almost impossible today. They bought homes, they started small businesses, they saved money when it felt like there was nothing left to save. They raised their kids to live better than they had, and quietly, without making a fuss, they started building a legacy that would change the course of generations. They didn't do it by following some magic formula or listening to financial gurus. They did it by leaning on simple principles, learned at home, passed down from parents to children, and held together by an idea that feels almost forgotten today. Every small sacrifice served a much bigger purpose. Here's the curious thing. When you look back at these stories from where we're standing now, you notice something unexpected. A lot of the hardships have changed shape, but the decisions that made the difference are still surprisingly relevant. The technology is different. The salaries are different. Housing prices have reached numbers that would have seemed impossible 60 years ago. And yet, the families who managed to get ahead shared a way of thinking that can still teach us a lot today. And maybe the biggest surprise of all is that their way of life was never built on making more money. It was built on never losing sight of what actually mattered. Before we talk about savings, about houses, about building wealth, we need to understand the world this all happened in. During the 1950s, the United States was going through a period of extraordinary economic growth. New highways connected entire cities. Factories were running at full capacity. Suburban neighborhoods were popping up around the big cities, and millions of veterans were coming home hoping to start a new life. On paper, it looked like an era of endless opportunity, but the reality was a lot more complicated for black communities. In a lot of states, segregation laws were still on the books. And even where those laws weren't written down, social and economic barriers persisted that were incredibly hard to overcome. There were neighborhoods where a black family could work for years, save every dollar they possibly could, and still find out that buying a home there was basically impossible. Some lenders would flat out reject loan applications simply because of where a property was located, or because of who lived in that neighborhood. Decades later, those practices would come to be widely studied under a name: redlining, a policy that left a deep scar on the history of housing in the United States. That policy had a name, and it had a date. In 1933, in the middle of the Great Depression, the government created an agency called the Homeowners Loan Corporation, with the stated goal of rescuing families who were about to lose their homes. But between 1935 and 1940, that same agency started drawing maps of hundreds of American cities. They color-coded every neighborhood by risk: green for the safest, blue and yellow for the in-between, and red for what they called hazardous. Almost every single time, that red color landed exactly on the neighborhoods where black families lived. It didn't matter if those families paid their bills on time. It didn't matter if their homes were well kept. The color on that map wasn't measuring anybody's character. It was measuring the color of their skin. And that map, drawn by officials who never set foot in most of those neighborhoods, decided for decades who could get a loan and who couldn't. And there was another wound, maybe even more painful, because it landed right after the greatest sacrifice of all. In 1944, the government passed a law that promised to change the lives of every soldier coming home from World War II. Cheap home loans, paid for college educations, help finding a job. It became known as the GI Bill, and for millions of white families, it was the gateway into the middle class. But that same law was administered state by state, and across a huge part of the country, especially in the South, black veterans who had risked their lives on those very same battlefields found those same doors slammed shut, again and again. Banks that refused to finance their homes, universities that wouldn't admit them, offices that lost their paperwork with no explanation. They had served the same country, under the same flag, and still, when they came home, they found out the promise never included their name, and having the money in hand didn't guarantee an open door either. In a lot of those new neighborhoods springing up around the cities, the sales contracts included a quiet clause. The property could never be resold or rented to a black family. They were called restrictive covenants, and for years, they were perfectly legal. So it wasn't enough to have saved for an entire decade. It wasn't enough to have the income, or the credit, or the will. If the neighborhood decided to shut the door, no amount of money in the world could open it back up. And here's the part that almost never gets told. Faced with a system that kept slamming the front door in their face, these families didn't just sit around waiting for someone to open it for them. They built their own door. If this part of the story is catching you off guard, hit like right now, because what's coming next is even more incredible. Long before that paper envelope in the kitchen drawer ever existed, there was an even older custom that a lot of Black and Caribbean families held on to, like a treasure passed down through generations. In West Africa, it was called esusu. A group of people, usually neighbors or trusted family members, would commit to putting in a small amount of money every week or every month. And taking turns, each member of the group would receive the whole pot everyone had saved together. That tradition crossed the ocean through centuries of forced displacement. In Jamaica, they called it a partner. In Trinidad, a susu. And when Black families and Caribbean communities found themselves in the same American cities, especially from the mid-20th century onward, a lot of them adopted that same logic. If the bank didn't trust us, we'd trust each other. A group of 10 or 12 people could pool together, month after month, enough money for one of them to buy a house, start a business, or cover a medical emergency, without asking anyone's permission. There was no signed contract, no lawyers involved. There was a person's word, and that word was worth more than any bank document. That spirit, turning exclusion into organization, is the very same spirit that later took the shape of a paper envelope tucked away in a drawer. Because when an entire community gets shut out of the tools the system offers, that community doesn't stop saving. It just builds its own system. A lot of families, in fact, did both at once. The envelope held the individual savings, week by week. The circle of trust held the collective savings, month by month. Two layers of the same armor. And still, every obstacle sparked a response. Where access to credit was limited, a lot of families built an almost extraordinary culture of saving. Where job opportunities were scarce, neighborhood networks, churches, and small businesses sprang up to help hold the whole community together. When one family got ahead, it rarely happened alone. Behind them, there were usually grandparents, neighbors, siblings, and friends who understood that one person's success opened a door for a lot of other people too. It was a philosophy completely different from the one that dominates so much of the world today. Instead of asking how much they could consume, a lot of people asked how much they could hold on to. Instead of chasing instant gratification, they learned to think long-term, not because somebody sat them down and explained compound interest in an economics class, but because experience had taught them that the future gets built through small decisions, repeated over and over again. Picture an ordinary evening in a city like Birmingham, Atlanta, or Detroit. The father comes home from work after a shift that started before the sun even came up. The mother has spent hours running the household, and in a lot of cases, she's also worked outside the home to bring in extra income. The kids finish their homework while the smell of dinner fills the kitchen. There are no screens, no online shopping, no notifications going off every few seconds. After dinner, the family stays at the table a few extra minutes. It's not some formal meeting, it's just a habit. They talk about the week's expenses, how much they managed to save, and their plans for the months ahead. It's in that moment, a moment that looks so simple, that something far more valuable than money starts to take shape. A lot of kids grew up watching their parents set aside a small amount of cash before paying for anything else. It didn't matter if it was $5 or 50 cents. What mattered was the habit. That single gesture sent a quiet message that would end up shaping the whole family. Protect your future first, and organize the present second. Nobody imagined back then that those kitchen table conversations would end up teaching a lesson a lot of grown adults are still trying to learn decades later. Here's the fascinating part. Those families didn't talk about wealth the way we understand it today. They weren't dreaming about luxury cars or becoming millionaires overnight. Their goal ran a lot deeper than that. They wanted stability. They wanted an unexpected illness not to wipe out years of hard work. They wanted their kids to have more opportunities than they did. They wanted to open the door of a house and know that every sacrifice had been worth it. That idea of prosperity was quiet, patient, and extraordinarily powerful. And it was exactly that understanding of success that gave rise to a decision that's almost disappeared today. A decision that, according to countless accounts from families of that era, completely changed the way they saved and let them get a little closer, step by step, to a goal that once seemed out of reach. It didn't require a college degree. It didn't depend on an exceptional salary. All it took was a discipline that gets harder to find every single year. And the story of how that habit began takes us to a small house in the American South, where a simple paper envelope held a lot more than just a few bills. That paper envelope didn't have some fancy logo on it, or an app that showed your balance in real time. It was just an ordinary envelope, its corners worn soft from being opened and closed so many times, kept in a kitchen drawer or tucked between some plates so nobody would stumble on it by accident. And yet, inside it, they were keeping something far more important than money.
They were keeping a promise. Every single week, no matter if work had been good or bad, a small piece of the paycheck ended up in there. Sometimes it was $5, sometimes barely $1. There were weeks when it seemed impossible to add anything at all, but somehow, somebody always found a way.
Not because that amount was going to change their lives overnight, but because breaking the habit was far more dangerous than saving too little. That difference, small as it may seem, was one of the greatest strengths of so many Black families who managed to get ahead during those years. That discipline wasn't born out of comfort. It was born out of uncertainty. You never knew when an illness, a layoff, or a broken-down car could throw the whole household off balance. Living with that reality turned saving from an option into a way of protecting the family.
While other people saw money as something meant to be spent as soon as possible, these families learned to see it as a tool for winning freedom. Freedom to say no to an unnecessary debt. Freedom to weather a rough patch without losing everything. Freedom for their kids to grow up without carrying the weight of their parents' financial worries. Over time, that mindset started reshaping a lot more than just a savings account. It changed the way big decisions got made. Before buying anything, an almost automatic question would come up. Do we actually need this? Or do we just want it right now? It sounds like a simple question, but it stopped hundreds of impulse buys. Not because these families went without everything, but because they'd learned to tell the difference between what was urgent and what actually mattered. That distinction, repeated year after year, ended up creating a stability that often went completely unnoticed from the outside.
It's fascinating to look back at family photographs from that era. In a lot of them, you don't see much in the way of luxury. The houses tend to be modest. The cars have some years on them. The clothes get worn until they truly can't be worn anymore. At first glance, it might look like a life full of limitations. But when you actually listen to the stories of people who grew up in those homes, you find a different reality. They talk about parents who radiated calm even when money was tight. They talk about mothers who could turn a simple dinner into a reason for the whole family to gather around the table.
They talk about neighbors who helped each other out without expecting anything in return. That sense of community made up for a lot of the hardships that existed just outside their front door. Churches played a fundamental role in all of this. They weren't just places of worship. They were spaces where people shared information, job opportunities, advice, and mutual support. If somebody found work, it was common for them to pass the word along to someone else in the community. If a family was going through a hard time, they rarely had to face it alone. That web of solidarity let a lot of people survive situations that, otherwise, could have wiped out years of hard work. Today we talk a lot about financial literacy, but in those communities, there was another kind of wealth that's a lot harder to measure: trust between people. If any of these stories are making you see money in a different light, drop a comment telling us which of these families surprised you the most. I would love to hear from you.
By the late 1950s, new ways of consuming started showing up. Advertising flooded television with modern appliances, flashier and flashier cars, and one very powerful idea: buy now, worry about it later. Bit by bit, credit started presenting itself as a shortcut to a better life. For a lot of families, that was tempting. It was the chance to get, right away, something they'd otherwise have had to wait years for. But the people who had learned to be wary of debt watched that shift with a whole lot of caution. It wasn't because they were against progress. It was because they knew the price of losing control over your own decisions. They had watched too many families get trapped paying off items for years that had lost their value long before the payments were even finished. They had seen how a small monthly payment could feel harmless, until it stacked up next to another one, and then another. Bit by bit, a paycheck stopped belonging to the person who'd earned it and started getting divided up among commitments made months or even years earlier. That experience left behind a lesson that's still strikingly relevant today. Just because you can afford to buy something doesn't mean you can afford to keep it. It's a distinction that gets overlooked all the time. Buying is a single moment. Holding on to that decision can turn into a burden for a long, long time. Black families understood that reality because they didn't have room to make too many mistakes. Every error cost months of hard work. So they learned to wait. And even though waiting was never easy, they discovered that patience carried a reward. Instant gratification could never match. Meanwhile, another quiet transformation was happening inside these homes. The kids were watching. They weren't sitting through long lectures about economics. They were learning by observation. They watched their parents fix furniture instead of replacing it. They watched clothes get mended before anyone bought something new. They watched an appliance last 20 years because somebody took the time to take care of it. Without even realizing it, they were absorbing a powerful idea. The real value of things was never in buying them. It was in making the most of what you already had. Decades later, a lot of those kids would look back on those scenes with a mix of admiration and nostalgia. Not because they wished they could go back to living with less, but because they came to understand that behind every small habit, there was an entire philosophy of life. A philosophy about responsibility, about shared effort, and about always thinking a little further past today. But maybe the biggest difference between those families and a lot of people today wasn't about money, it was about time. These days, everything seems to demand instant results. We want to save fast, invest fast, buy fast, and see changes fast. Back then, though, there was a much deeper understanding that the things that really matter need time to grow. A tree doesn't cast shade the same day it's planted. A home doesn't get built in just a few months. Wealth was seen as a marathon, not a sprint. And it was exactly that patience that let so many families turn small steps forward into major achievements. Not because they stumbled into some extraordinary opportunity, but because they never stopped moving forward, even when progress felt painfully slow. There were weeks when they could barely save a few dollars. There were years when it felt like nothing was changing at all. And yet, when they looked back a decade later, they discovered something remarkable. Those tiny steps, invisible day to day, had covered an enormous distance. The next part of this story shows just how far that mindset could go in changing a family's entire future. It all started with a decision that, from the outside, looked like a mistake. Their neighbors couldn't understand why they'd pass on a bigger house when, from where they stood, they could have tried to get one. A lot of people figured they just lacked ambition. The truth was exactly the opposite. That choice held a strategy so smart it would go on to become the single greatest financial advantage they'd have for the next 20 years. And understanding why they made that call helps explain one of the most forgotten principles behind building wealth. The house they picked wasn't the prettiest one on the block. It wasn't the biggest, and it wasn't the one that turned heads as you walked by. It had a simple front, small rooms, and a yard that needed a lot of work. More than one neighbor figured that family was just settling for less. Nobody realized that by choosing a home they could actually afford, without drowning financially, they were making one of the smartest decisions of their entire lives. Turn on notifications so you don't miss how this decision turns out, because what they did next changed the course of 3 generations. During those years, a lot of Black families understood that buying a house wasn't the finish line. It was the beginning of a responsibility that could last decades. They knew that an overly expensive house didn't just mean a higher payment. It also meant less room to absorb whatever life threw at them. A major repair, an illness, or the temporary loss of a job could turn a dream into an unbearable burden. So when it came time to decide, they'd often go for a more modest house, one that let them sleep soundly every single night. It might sound like an unexciting choice, but it held a deeply powerful idea inside it. Peace of mind has financial value too. Living below your means wasn't seen as failure. It was a strategy. It meant holding on to your ability to choose. It meant your money kept working for the family, instead of the other way around. Those modest houses, bought with patience somewhere between the 1950s and 1960s, would eventually turn into something their own owners could hardly have imagined. A starting point. A place from which, 20 or 30 years later, a grandchild could take out a loan to go to school, or a daughter could open her first business, using as collateral the very house her grandparents had chosen with so much care. The real inheritance was never the house itself. It was the door that house ended up opening for the ones who came after. As the years went by, that difference started becoming visible. While some people put every single raise toward upgrading their lifestyle, others took those same raises and used them to strengthen their future. When a small bump came through in their paycheck, they didn't rush out to trade in the car or move into a bigger house. A lot of the time, they didn't even change their lifestyle at all. They kept living pretty much the same way and put that difference straight into savings or toward paying down existing debt. That kind of decision took patience, because from the outside, it looked like they weren't moving forward at all. The neighbors were buying new appliances, remodeling their houses, trading in their cars more and more often, but the people who knew how to wait were quietly building something you couldn't see from the street. They were buying time. They were buying peace of mind. They were buying freedom, and that freedom would show up exactly when nobody expected it to. There were families who, after 10 or 15 years of steady effort, could weather a financial crisis without losing their home. Others managed to help a child pay for college without going into debt. Some opened a small business using money they'd saved over the years, instead of relying completely on loans. None of those achievements happened by accident. They were the result of hundreds of decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. Maybe that's one of the greatest lessons those generations left behind. Wealth rarely changes a life overnight. What really transforms a family are the habits it keeps up when nobody's watching. Another thing that rarely gets talked about is just how important it was to learn a trade. In a lot of Black communities, knowing how to fix a roof, repair electrical wiring, sew clothes, or work with wood wasn't just some useful skill. It was a way of protecting the family's wealth. Every repair they could handle themselves was money that stayed in the household. Every skill they learned meant one less thing they had to depend on someone else for. Kids grew up watching the adults around them solve problems with real ingenuity. Not because they had time to spare, but because a lot of the time, there simply wasn't another option. That mindset raised generations of people who were incredibly resourceful. Before replacing something, they'd try to fix it. Before giving up in the face of a setback, they'd look for another way through. Over time, that ability to adapt turned into a massive economic advantage. It never showed up on any bank statement, but it was there every single time a family found a way past an obstacle without going into debt. Today we live surrounded by quick fixes. If something stops working, our first thought is usually to go buy another one. But those families understood a truth that still holds up. The more you depend on buying your way out of a problem, the more vulnerable you become when hard times come around. There was another habit that made a profound difference. Success was never measured by what just one person achieved. It was measured by what the whole family achieved. When someone got ahead, it was common for them to turn around and help a brother, a nephew, or even a neighbor find better opportunities. That sense of shared responsibility strengthened entire communities. Far from being a sign of weakness, that kind of cooperation was a genuine survival strategy. Financial hardships were a lot easier to overcome when there was a network of people willing to support one another. That culture of collaboration explains why so many communities managed to move forward, even in deeply unjust circumstances. And here's a reflection that's hard to ignore. We often think building wealth comes down purely to money, but history shows it also comes down to trust, to relationships, to the ability to work together, year after year, chasing a shared goal. The families who managed to leave a legacy weren't always the ones who earned the most. A lot of the time, they were the ones who cooperated best. Save this video and hit subscribe right now, because these are words you're going to want to come back to every time you feel the pull to spend instead of build. As the 1960s rolled on, the United States started changing fast. The civil rights movement drove historic progress that opened up new opportunities for millions of people. But those changes didn't erase, overnight, inequalities that had been piling up for decades. A lot of black families were still facing enormous challenges, just trying to access certain neighborhoods, get financing on equal terms, or build wealth at the same pace as other American households. In 1968, a law finally arrived that carried the name of all those slammed doors, the Fair Housing Act. On paper, it outlawed redlining and the restrictive covenants that, for more than 3 decades, had decided who could buy where. But a law signed in Washington doesn't erase, with the stroke of a pen, maps that had been drawn 30 years earlier, and it doesn't undo the head start those maps had already handed some families over others. The law opened the door. It didn't give back the time that had already been lost. And that's exactly why the stories we've walked through so far are so inspiring. They're not stories about people who had a clear path ahead of them. They're stories about families who learned to keep moving forward, even when the road was full of obstacles. And there's still the most important lesson of all left to tell. Because there was one principle that never showed up in any savings passbook, in any bank, in any sales contract. It was something a lot simpler, but also a lot harder to hold on to. A principle that families passed down generation after generation. And that, according to the people who lived it, was the real foundation everything else was built on. That principle had nothing to do with money. It had to do with how you chose to think. And that's exactly where this story ends, and where the last part of our journey begins. If you had to sum up, in one single idea, everything that let so many black families move forward between the 1950s and the 1970s, you probably wouldn't be talking about money.
You'd be talking about mindset. Because money could disappear. Because of an illness, a bad harvest, a factory shutting down, or an unfair decision made in some office hundreds of miles away.
What nobody could ever take from them was the way they had learned to face their problems. While the world kept changing at breakneck speed, a lot of these families kept believing in something that feels almost revolutionary today. The future isn't improvised, it's prepared for. Every dollar saved, every item repaired instead of replaced, every conversation around the table, every quiet sacrifice, they all served one single purpose.
Making sure the next generation started out just a little further ahead than the one before it. And that's exactly what happened. Thousands of kids grew up watching their parents give up small pleasures without ever feeling like they were losing out. They did it because they had a much bigger vision in front of them.
They knew that real success wasn't about impressing the neighbors for one weekend. It was about building a life that could hold up for decades. Over time, a lot of those kids made it to college. Others opened small businesses. Some bought a home their own parents never imagined they'd be able to have. None of those achievements just appeared out of thin air. They were the result of hundreds of invisible decisions that almost nobody applauded while they were happening. Maybe that's one of the greatest lessons history has to offer us. We live in a time where almost everything gets measured by speed.
We want instant results. We expect a change in habits to transform our lives in just a few weeks. But the families we've just gotten to know understood something completely different. They knew that roots grow underground, long before a tree ever starts casting shade.
It's also important to remember that these stories aren't meant to romanticize the past. Between 1950 and 1970, millions of black families had to face deeply unjust barriers. Segregation, unequal access to housing, difficulty getting financing, and countless other forms of discrimination shaped their lives for decades. And that's exactly why it's so remarkable to see how so many people still manage to build wealth, stability, and opportunity for their children, even when the rules of the game weren't the same for everyone. This story doesn't prove it was easy. It proves that even when circumstances are hard, certain decisions still carry extraordinary power. And maybe that's exactly why these stories still move people so many years later. Because they're not just about money, they're about dignity, they're about responsibility, they're about families who chose to think beyond next week in order to protect the future of people who hadn't even been born yet. Today, we're facing different challenges. Housing costs more, the cost of living has gone up, and technology keeps pushing us to consume faster than ever. But underneath all that noise, the fundamental questions are still exactly the same.
Are we building something that lasts? Will today's decisions help the people who come after us? Are we buying things, or are we buying peace of mind? There might not be one single answer that fits everybody. Every family lives through different circumstances, and every generation faces its own set of challenges. But history shows that the people who manage to change the direction of their lives almost never do it because of some lucky break. They do it because, year after year, they keep up habits most people give up on way too soon.
And that's what turns these stories into something worth so much more than just an economics lesson. It turns them into a lesson about character. Because character shows up when nobody's watching. When you choose to save even though nobody's going to congratulate you for it. When you choose to repair instead of replace.
When you turn down a debt you could easily take on, because you know freedom is worth more than instant comfort.
When you teach your kids through example, and not just through words. Those decisions never make the headlines, but they're the ones that end up writing a family's story. 50 years from now, somebody's going to talk about our generation the same way we talk today about those families who lived between the 1950s and the 1970s. And the real question is, what will they say? That we lived consuming more and more? Or that we knew how to build something built to last a lot longer than we did? The answer starts with the decisions we make the moment we turn off this video, because the past can't be changed, but the next chapter of our story is still a completely blank page. And if you know somebody who needs to hear this message, share this video with them right now. Sometimes just one story can change the way somebody sees their entire life. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear them, and see what new ideas come out of it. Thank you for making it all the way to the end. That means you value knowledge over noise. See you in the next video.